Smart, ambitious professionals are making worse decisions than they used to, not because we got worse at our jobs, but because something about how our brains are operating has quietly changed. So here, have you ever made a decision that felt completely right? You were convinced, and later you couldn't explain how you missed something so obvious? And I don't mean a rush decision, not a knee-jerk one over a glass of beer, but one that you thought about deeply, one that felt completely right at the moment. And this type of experience has a name, and it has a mechanism. But first, I'm Gwen Bach. I have a master's degree in applied neuroscience from King's College in London, and I'm the founder of Applied Brain Lab. Here we study how modern work environments degrade decision-making and decision quality, and what neuroscience and applied psychology has to say about it. So here's what most people get wrong about decision-making. They assume it's about intelligence or experience, or how hard you think about things. And yes, of course, this matters, but decision quality is also determined by your operating conditions. And by this, I mean your brain is not a machine that has the same output no matter what's happening around. Your brain is a biological system, and biological systems, they respond to their environments. So what do I mean by environment? So I mean how much information you're processing at once, how many unresolved problems are sitting or floating around your head, and how much uncertainty are you currently dealing with, and how much stress is your system here carrying. All of these change how your brain evaluates a decision, not as a metaphor, but I mean as a mechanism. So here's how decisions actually work in your brain. And you see different options compete with each other. Evidence accumulates, and once that evidence crosses a threshold, the brain commits to a choice. But the whole process runs on cognitive resources, and those resources have a limit. There's something called working memory, the mental space where you hold and compare information while you're thinking through a problem, and that is surprisingly small. Most of us, we can actively hold only 4 things at once, and that's about on a typical day, where you get emails, messages, meetings, you have unresolved decisions, strategic problems, operational fires, and each one takes up your mental space. And when they pile up, your brain enters a state of high cognitive load or overload. And that's the part that really matters. Cognitive load doesn't just make you tired, it changes how you make your decision. Under high cognitive load, your brain starts to cut corners, not because you're lazy, but because it's trying to cope. And your attention narrows and you search less. You commit earlier and you default to what feels familiar. And these mental shortcuts, they're really fast and they're efficient, but they simplify complex problems. And when this analysis narrows, the chance of missing something important goes up without you feeling like anything is wrong. And that's really the dangerous part, because decisions made under high cognitive load, they can feel completely clear, completely right, certain. And the brain hits its decision threshold before the problem was fully explored. But once that threshold is crossed, it feels correct. So when did you last stop to ask yourself when that might be happening in your work right now? And now let us add modern day stress on top of that. And this is where science gets really specific. Research published in Nature last year mapped exactly what chronic stress does to the brain circuits that govern our decision-making. And there are 2 pathways that really matter here. One supports what researchers call agency, our ability to think through consequences, update our thinking when things change, and make deliberate, goal-directed choices. The other drives habit, automatic behavior based on our past patterns. It's fast, it's rigid, and normally our brain balances these. And it's deliberate when it counts and automatic when things are fine. But under chronic stress, that kind of builds up over weeks and months and that balance starts to break. The deliberate pathway gets suppressed and the habit pathway takes over, which means you become less able to adapt when something changes, and you're less likely to update a decision when new information comes in, and more likely to keep repeating patterns that aren't working, and less likely to notice that any of this is happening. So maybe that sounds familiar to you, or you've seen it in people around it. And again, I don't mean this as a metaphor. It's been mapped out at the level of individual brain circuits. So when you put sustained cognitive load and chronic stress together, here's what you actually get. You get a decision-making system that has shifted from evaluating consequences to executing patterns. It doesn't feel like decline, and you feel like you're very decisive. And that is a diagnostic problem. So now you understand the mechanism. And let's make this a bit more concrete, because knowing this in theory is one thing, recognizing it in our actual work is another. So the thing draining our cognitive resources that really nobody's talking about right now is that most people, when we think about what's making our thinking harder, we point to the big stuff, a big, difficult project, a high-stakes decision, a very difficult quarter in business. But research points to something very else, something smaller, more constant, and very invisible. And I like to call it microfrictions. And that's the term we use for small, everyday frictions that accumulate across our working day. And they are unclear processes, unnecessary interruptions, bad instructions, redundant steps, context switching. And none of them feel significant on their own, but that's exactly what makes them dangerous. So here's what is actually happening in our brain when we hit a microfriction. Every time we get interrupted mid-task, our brain has to do something called working memory reconstruction. So we're holding a set of variables in our mind, and the problem that we were working on, the context we were in that moment, that thinking, that interruption displaces that. And when you come back, your brain also has to rebuild it. And that rebuilding process takes cognitive resources, real ones. And research is quite clear about it. You don't fully return to the same state of focus that you were in before. And that's a cost every time. And research shows that people who are interrupted during complex tasks complete these tasks significantly more slowly. And in some experiments, uninterrupted workers finished up to 30 times faster than those who were regularly interrupted. And that's not a small difference. And very important also, error rates go up, not because we stop caring, but because our cognitive researchers needed to catch errors are the same resources being depleted by this interruption. And this is not because people stop caring, but because the resources needed to catch these errors are the same resources being depleted by the interruption. Now here's where it connects back to what we talked about earlier. Remember cognitive load, the state where your brain's working memory is stretched thin and those decision shortcuts kick in? Microfrictions are one of the mechanisms that can push us into that state. And again, it's not just one big event, but it's dozens of small ones throughout the day. Each unclear process costs a small amount of research. Same for interruptions. And each notification from your phone that you choose to ignore, it still registers, and your brain processes it enough to decide to ignore it. So by mid-afternoon, many ambitious professionals and business owners, we are operating in a sustained state of high cognitive load, not because of the difficulty of our work, but because of the accumulated cost of the environment that we're working in. And in that state, the decision shortcuts we talked about earlier are already running. And then there is another layer to this that research flags. those micro frictions, they don't just drain our cognitive resources, they also function as chronic low-level stressors, and those daily hassles, frustrations, and those frictions, they trigger the same stress response pathways as larger stressors, just in a much lower intensity and more frequently, which means they're also activating the same shift we discussed in the brain's decision-making circuits: agency pathway, suppressed habit pathway, recruited, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally across a working day, and obviously across a week, a month, a year. And that cumulative effect of microfriction isn't just tiredness, it's a very gradual, measurable shift in how our brain is making decisions, happening below our conscious awareness. And most of us, we attribute this to a long day, to hard work. But neuroscience says it could be something way more specific going on. So, what does degraded decision-making actually look like? And here's the part that most of us professionals find uncomfortable. Degraded decision quality doesn't look like confusion, and definitely not like poor judgment. It doesn't look like anything from the inside. It feels like confident, I made the right decisions. And here are the patterns to watch out for. If you find yourself gravitating towards an option that you've decided on before that feels familiar, and that option that might require less cognitive effort to evaluate, when you notice that, you can realize that you've stopped asking questions you used to ask, not consciously, and you don't just think not to ask them, you feel certain earlier in a decision process than the complexity of the problem warrants. You find it harder to change course once you've committed, even when new information suggests you should. And you start noticing, sometimes weeks later that something obviously was sitting in plain sight and you simply didn't realize it. And these are not signs of a bad decision maker. They're just a symptom of a decision-making system operating under load that our brains were not designed to live with. So why experience doesn't protect you, and why it can actually make this worse. And this is the part that surprises most people. You'd think that experience would buffer us against it, but the more decisions you've made, the better equipped you are to make them under pressure. And in some ways, that can be true, but there is a catch. Experience works by building patterns. Your brain learns what a good hire looks like, and it also knows what a bad project looks like. And when a market signal, and what a market signal means. And these patterns are really valuable for us. They allow faster, more efficient decisions, but under cognitive load and chronic stress, the brain leans on those patterns more heavily. And that can create a very specific vulnerability. So when the situation in front of you is genuinely new, but it looks similar to or resembles a familiar one, your brain maps it onto the old pattern and commits and decides without fully evaluating what's actually different. And the more experienced you are, the more patterns you have memorized and available, and the more fluent your brain can execute them, even when they don't quite fit. Which is why some of the most experienced leaders in high-demand environments are also the ones most susceptible to this particular failure mode, not because they're less capable, but because their brain has way more material to work with and more reasons to trust it. Habit or agency, which system is actually making our decisions? And let's bring this back to my favorite topic, neuroscience. Remember those two pathways, agency and habit? And here's how to start recognizing which one is running the given decision. Agency looks like this. You're genuinely considering the specific circumstances in front of you. You're asking, what's different about this situation? and you're open to a conclusion that you did not expect. And you're willing to slow down if the decision or problem asks for it. And habits looks more like the decision feels obvious, you've seen this before, you know what to do, and it's really simple and straightforward, and the answer arrives very quickly, and you have a very high confidence in that answer. And the idea of reconsidering feels unnecessary, even slightly irritating. And now, here's the important question. How often does the second one feel indistinguishable from good judgment? Because under stress, chronic stress and cognitive load, it almost always does. The goal isn't to eliminate habit. Habits are efficient and often correct. The goal is to know which system is running and to be able to choose deliberately when the stakes are high enough to warrant it. And that capacity to recognize which mode you're in and to switch when you need to is what I like to call cognitive integrity. And it's what gets very quietly eroded when the conditions for thinking deteriorate. So the natural question then becomes, what do you actually do about this? If cognitive load is degrading decision quality, the solution is not to simply try harder to think clearly. The research points somewhere very different. You stabilize decision-making by changing the structure around your thinking. And there are some three practical levers that we can use immediately. The first one is cognitive offloading. Your working memory is extremely limited, remember, 4 pieces. Most people, again, we can hold a handful, but mostly it's 4. And when a decision lives entirely inside your head, those variables compete for the same limited space as everything else you're managing that day. Cognitive offloading means moving part of that thinking process out of your head and into the real world, the environment. And the simplest way to do that is what I like to call thinking on paper. So instead of trying to mentally juggle those variables, the risks, the constraints, the timelines, the people, everything else, you start writing them down, pen and paper. And not as some weird type of reflection or anything, but use it as a procedural thinking tool. Because your thinking slows down and you externalize the variables. You start mapping your decisions on paper and you force your brain to slow down and look at the structure of the problem instead of holding fragments of it in working memory. And once these variables are visible, your brain no longer has to spend cognitive resources remembering them, and those resources can now be used to evaluate the decision itself. And this is why in some of the most effective decision environments, from aviation to surgery to engineering, they rely heavily on written procedures, checklists, and externalized thinking system. And they're not meant as a crutch, but more as a cognitive infrastructure. The second lever that I like is task simplification. And one of the fastest ways to overload our brain is to run too many parallel cognitive processes at the same time. Multiple decision, and we all know multitasking doesn't work. And we hold multiple unresolved problems or strategic threads in our head. And again, each of them occupies a big amount of our working memory. So instead of evaluating one decision deeply, our brain starts to rapidly switch between them. And each and every switch carries a cognitive cost. So high-performing professionals often assume this is simply the price of modern work. But decision science suggests something quite different. The brain performs best when complex decisions are processed sequentially, one after the other, rather than multiple at the same time. That means deliberately narrowing the number of active decisions you're evaluating at one time. And I don't mean to eliminate them, but by structuring them. Finish evaluating one decision and then move to the next. Sequential thinking dramatically reduces cognitive load because working memory no longer has to maintain multiple competing decision trees at the same time. The third lever is digital input management, and I'm a huge fan of that because many of us, we operate inside an environment that is constantly competing for our attention. We get messages, the phone rings, notifications, news feeds, we get commentaries, short form content, and each one introduces small fragments of information that our brain has to process, even if we immediately dismiss them. And over time, this creates continuous background cognitive load. So imagine every piece of information we consume is training our brain's attention. And you fill that diet with fast, fragmented, high stimulating inputs, your brain adapts to those patterns. But if you deliberately shape your information environment towards slower, more structured input, aligned with your goals, you reduce unnecessary cognitive load. For ambitious professionals and business owners, this means being selective about what enters our cognitive system during the day. And I don't mean that as a productivity trick, but as a decision quality intervention, because attention is the gateway to working memory, and working memory is the gateway to decision quality. None of those tools are complicated, but they all do the same thing because they change the operating conditions of our brain in this modern world we live in. And when those operating conditions improve, decision quality very often improves with them. And again, decision quality doesn't just collapse overnight, it narrows gradually, mostly invisible to us, and the brain adapts in ways that feel efficient but are inaccurate. And once you understand that, the question changes. It's not, am I smart enough to make good decisions? A good decision. It's more like, are the conditions my brain is operating in still producing accurate output? And do I have a way to find out? And if you want to start finding out, I have created the default mode diagnostic. It's a free tool. It takes less than 5 minutes and you can get it on my website. The link is below, appliedbrainlab.com.